This episode of Q Point Podcast is pre-recorded, produced and sponsored by Quirk, broker at Next Home Experience.
Different views.
I know your story.
From different cues.
Incredible job.
He's David Quirk.
You brought it up.
And she's Corenna Quirk.
Imagine.
This is
Q Point.
Joining us now in studio is Democratic gubernatorial candidate Angus King III. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Really happy to be here.
We are very appreciative.
So why are you running for governor?
I'm running because life's just become too hard for too many folks here in Maine. And I really thought I could make a difference. I thought there was an opportunity. You think about how can you have the most impact on the most people in the most positive way. And this was an opportunity I thought where I had something to offer. We've got a lot of people who are really struggling in this state, and I thought we needed a different approach. We needed a fresh perspective, and I thought we needed someone who had the experience that I've had applied to the moment we're in. So I thought there was a real opportunity, and now I'm running as hard as I can to take advantage of that opportunity and to make a difference here in Maine.
I know your father pretty well. I know you a little bit, but why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Well, I was born in Skowhegan, and I grew up in Topsom. My parents lived there when we were growing up, so I lived in Topsom. My dad lived in Brunswick and grew up there. I have been interested, this is not going to surprise you, in politics for a long time. My first job when I was 17 years old was working for Mike Dukakis on his presidential campaign. We all know how that turned out, but as a 17-year-old, it was a pretty heady experience, and I was excited to do that. And some of the people I worked for then ended up working for the Clinton-Gore campaign. So I went and worked for them again in the middle of my college experience. So I went away to college and took a year off during college to go and work for Bill Clinton, and then finished college and then went and worked for the president and the White House for a number of years, which was one of life's great experiences. I mean, you can't imagine being in your 20s, walking into the White House every day and feeling like you're engaged in things that impact people's lives every single day in a meaningful way. And that was a terrific experience, but I also was very interested in the business world, and so left the White House and have spent really most of my adult career working in a couple of different businesses. The first was in affordable housing. I built affordable housing all over the country for thousands of people, housing that's actually affordable, which feels like it's harder and harder to come by these days. And then I spent a lot of time building solar and wind projects, again, across the country and around the world. We lived in Portland during all of that. Somewhere in the middle there, I found a bride and brought her to Portland, and we have a couple of kids who are obviously my pride and joy, and we can talk about them a little bit more. And then after the solar and wind business, I went to go work for a gas utility, and in that utility thought, we've got to be thinking differently. How are we making sure that we're responding to our customers? And a lot of our customers wanted a lower carbon solution. So I started a renewable energy company inside that utility, which I'm happy to talk about more, but it was a great exercise in innovation and persistence and trying to find common ground with people and trying to set a direction and then getting people moving forward and actually building projects. To me, it was an opportunity to think differently, to innovate, to listen to your customer, and then ultimately to get things done. So that's been most of my career since.
I've also noticed you have quite the education.
I've been very lucky in my life. I went to a fabulous college and learned a ton. I was a government major and an economics minor. And then I did go to business school as well. And it was a phenomenal experience, mostly in terms of you got to learn so much about how the world actually works, the challenges that people face every day. I got to work and learn alongside a lot of really brilliant people who remain friends and mentors and advisors to this day. So if anything, education is a real opportunity to meet other great people and you follow along with them in your life. So I'm grateful for the education that I had. And in some ways, it ended up setting me up for the career that I've had.
Well, let's talk about housing. We have quite the housing crisis here in Maine. What is your plan for that?
Yeah, I like to think of it as a housing opportunity. Certainly, housing is one of our biggest challenges for a number of reasons. The first is, as you know, it's become twice as expensive as it was 7 years ago. That is not a very long time, and it's certainly outstripped wage growth for people in our state. And the real challenge is that it really stymies a lot of movement in our state. It keeps young people from being able to move here. My own sister, I have a much younger sister, my dad's daughter, who had an impossible time to find a house. Ultimately, they found one, but they ended up having to do a lot of work. They ended up having to take a lot of showers at our house while they were working on their own. That is keeping young people who we desperately need to come into our state from being able to move here. It also slows down businesses who are having a really hard time recruiting people into our state. And I talk to every business owner I find who says, I literally cannot find people who can afford to work here and live here. And that's at almost every level of income. So it's stymieing that, and it keeps people from moving for social reasons, for love, for an expanded family, for all kinds of challenges. So the problem is very real. And to me, the fundamental challenge is around we've made it very, very hard to build things. And I've spent my career building things, fundamentally. I've spent my career building housing and energy projects. And really, a lot of what's motivating my running today is the frustration that I've seen and has grown in me in terms of the disconnect between policy and people who actually do the work on the ground. And I think there are a lot of very well-intentioned rules and regulations that at their outset and one at a time were a good idea or were well-intended. But I think now we've got this place where we've got sort of death by 1,000 good intentions, and it makes it almost impossible to do a lot of things. I was walking through downtown Bangor today. There are a bunch of stores on the first floor. There could be apartments on the second floor. And yet the requirements in order to convert those ends up adding millions of dollars to what you could do. So you end up with a less vibrant downtown, lower housing availability, which means higher cost. And that's a real loss, I think, for a lot of our downtowns. And it's one tiny example where I think we could make it a lot easier. So I don't know if it's a crisis, but it is a huge problem and a huge barrier, I think, for our economy. So what do you do? The first thing you do is it's cultural. I think there's got to be a view at the state of how do we get to yes, as opposed to how do we get to process. There are a lot of housing developments where it just takes an extraordinary amount of time to get through the process. And we've made it so that it's actually more expensive to build an affordable house than it is to build a market rate house. That feels backwards to me. There should be a way through on that. Let's start by thinking about you've got to have DOT, you've got to have MISHA, you've got to have Department of Environmental Protection. You've got to do all of these different departments, and some of them might move quickly on something, some might move slowly, and you end up with this sort of disconnected process. And there's not a lot of realization, or there's not a lot of focus on how do we get to yes? How do we have a goal around we're going to build, let's say 5,000 or 10,000 units a year? And we're going to start actually making some progress on this. The good news is there are a lot of good people in Maine who are working really hard and have a lot of great ideas on how we can innovate, how we can build more housing. We're going to innovate on materials like they're doing at Timber HP. We're going to innovate on design like Zero Energy Homes is doing in Searsport. They just built this house that is under $300,000 and has essentially no utility bills, built in a modular fashion. I think there's a lot more we can do there. We've got to think hard about how do we help towns with their zoning and their comprehensive plans so they do support more building. And I think we've got to think about at the state, what are we doing on innovative financing so that we're helping towns that want to build more housing, for example, on infrastructure costs? Or are we setting up other ways to help with innovative financing that helps bring costs down so that people can afford to build and afford to buy a home? So I think there's a lot of work we can do at the state level. I think there's a lot of help we can give at the town level. And ultimately, it's around, let's say that this is an important priority for the state, and let's all start rowing in the same direction. And I think that will also really make a difference.
You are listening to Q Point Podcast. I'm Corenna Quirk, co-hosting with my husband, David Quirk, and we are having a conversation with Democratic gubernatorial candidate Angus King III.
Obviously, being an older state or the oldest state in the nation, we are trying to get younger people in to keep the hospital costs down. The older the community is, the more strain it's going to have on the hospitals.
Yeah, there's no question. Although I like to think of it as we're the wisest state in the country, there's a lot of opportunity actually to engage that population in a way that's productive. In Gorham, there's a place where they've put a childcare center next to a retirement community so that there's actually engagement both for the kids and for the folks in the retirement community. And that's intentional. That really actually is the kind of thing that we should be taking more advantage of. There are a lot of retired people who can be very helpful as you're starting up a small business. Or I think it's important for us to not just say, this is a problem, and let's talk about what are the opportunities? How do we lean into that issue? But we also have to think about how can we lead the country because of that population group that we have? How can we be the best place to retire with dignity? How can we help solve some of these things? I think it's really important, as you talked about healthcare and hospitals. First is about the care workers themselves. We are short on care workers, and if you can't find the care, the requirements that it takes on a family member are extraordinary, and it ends up having a big impact on the family, has an impact on their company, has an impact on their job. So I think what we can do to help think about caregivers is really important. The next is about what can we do with the housing stock that we have. We do not have enough nursing homes and facilities for that population. So more and more people, I think, ultimately are going to age in place. And I was visiting with the Bangor Habitat for Humanity. We worked on one of their houses. My campaign team spent a day volunteering. And they said that a huge amount of their work is retrofitting homes so that people can age in place with grab bars and all the rest. And I think we're going to have to do more of that because we've got to take care of this population and figure out how we're going to do it. And on the healthcare side, we also have a shortage of workers. So I think Maine's got to do a lot more work on how are we training workers? How are we attracting people into the healthcare space? Are we literally, some states have started to do work with training kids in middle school and high school so that they know what careers are available to them, so that they have an opportunity to learn those skills and then be a part of that workforce when they graduate. And I think that's going to be an important piece of how do we take care of this population. Another piece that I'm worried about that doesn't get a lot of talk on the campaign trail is the fact that we do have this older population. The impact of dementia care is going to be extraordinary. I saw a number the other day that said it was going to be $3 or $4 billion over the next decade of cost. And there are a lot of innovations that are being tested across the country. I know of a company out in the Pacific Northwest that's doing a lot of very innovative work on how do you lower costs and provide better care. And I think we're going to have to really start to explore some of those things. Otherwise, we're just not ready and the population is coming. So I think we've got to be more proactive on that side of things. Healthcare broadly, there are other things we should talk about, but not as it relates to the elderly as much as just the population as a whole. And I'm happy to talk about that too.
Well, yes, as a matter of fact, with our hospitals closing and OBs closing, walk-in cares closing, it's been quite a strain on rural Maine.
Yeah, and ultimately it's a strain on the entire population. People don't stop getting sick when a hospital closes. It just means that they need care somewhere else. So I think it's really important that we think about it on a holistic level, on a system-wide level. Because right now, the hospitals are making decisions that are rational for the hospitals. Doctors have their perspective, nurses have their perspective, and patients have their perspectives. But they don't often meet together. And I think it's important that we take a step back and say, okay, we have 1.4 million people, 100 buildings, 1,000 doctors, and a certain amount of money. What do we do to make sure that we take the best care of this population? You have to have a trauma center, for example, in Bangor. If it closes in Bangor, that's a problem for Portland. Even though it doesn't feel like it, obviously, it certainly is because those patients have to go somewhere and they're that much sicker if they had to take the trip all the way down south. So you've got to have a systematic overlook on how are we looking at this whole thing together. And that's an important role, I think, for government because they can't do it because of anti-competitive reasons on their own. But I think being the convener in chief, I think, is an important role for the governor. The next piece, though, is around how are we thinking about public health? To me, this whole system is struggling because of costs at the end of the day. And the cost problem only gets solved if you really start thinking about how do you make sure that people stay healthier longer. And it starts with public health. It starts with early screening. It starts with prevention. You can't legislate eating your fiber and doing jumping jacks, but we've got to figure out how do we make sure that people have more regular access to primary care where we do not spend a lot of money right now. But I think you've got to keep people out of the ER. You've got to keep them out of those very expensive specialty practices. And I think we can do a lot more. Another version of that is someone was telling me about work that had been done where, not a surprise, if you are hungry or cold or underhoused or don't have transportation, you also are sicker. And those social determinants of health have a huge impact on our population's health. And for people who fit into that category, if they go into the hospital, often to the ER, which is the most expensive place you could possibly get health care, if you then have a community nurse come and visit the home, their chances of going back to the hospital decrease by 90%. That's the kind of thing I think we should be investing in terms of how do we make sure, again, that the broader population is healthier to the point where they don't end up having to go to the hospital, which is a very expensive place to be. So I think there's opportunity to reduce the cost because that's ultimately the underlying challenge that we've all got. And if we can think about it together in this systemic way, I think that'll make a difference.
A few months ago, before Bill Diamond passed away, we did a fundraiser with him at our Augusta Ford store. And obviously, he's one of the big advocates for foster children. And we've had quite a few that has passed away. What are your plans on fixing that?
Bill was a great Mainer, and we're lucky for all the work that he did. And this is a huge problem. It's something that we've got to work on. And I think DHHS is a real opportunity for us. There's not a single bad intention in that building. No one goes to work there saying, I'm going to not take care of somebody today. They are all well-intentioned, but I think there's a sea of regulatory process, things that just simply don't work. I'm sure that is as frustrating to the people who work there as it is to the people who are trying to access the care. And to me, this is actually a government-wide challenge. How do we make sure that we are responsive to the people who need our help and that the government is not in the way for the people who are sort of raring to go? There's a real opportunity, and people can feel the need to make sure that the government is more responsive. In your business, you think a lot about what do your customers need? How do I respond to what the customers want? And right now, it's a very difficult time to access these services from DHHS. I have a friend who's a very accomplished, capable person. His mom was ailing, and he tried to access services for her. It took weeks for him to just sort through the myriad details and processes, and ultimately couldn't find his way through it. And this is someone who has resources and time and huge capability. So for somebody who has none of those things, it's even harder. So I think it's something that we've really got to focus on. I think DHHS is a particular pain point, but I don't think it's different from a lot of other parts of the state government. We just saw the example of how not to do it with a guy in Washington with a chainsaw, but that doesn't mean that there is an opportunity to reinvent government, to really make sure that we are responsive. When I was younger, I worked for Al Gore, who did a lot of work on reinventing government. He did it thoughtfully, he did it carefully, but he did it very diligently in terms of how are we going to make government more responsive? How are we going to reduce the complexity? How are we going to make it do a better job delivering the service that people are paying for? Ultimately, that's what we're doing, is we are paying for this communal public service. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to try and make it more responsive, because ultimately that's the job of the government.
What's your energy plan? Do you have one?
I do. I think about this a lot, and I've spent a lot of my career in the energy business. It starts with, we've got to think about things differently, and we've got to start thinking about it again, not unlike with healthcare, at the systems level. Number one, we've got to stop doing things that don't make sense or that aren't good for ratepayers. We have had programs over the last number of years that have ended up potentially well-intentioned, but have very expensive impacts on ratepayers here in Maine, and costs are higher as a result. The good news is, I think there are also things we can do. For example, permitting reform. There are places in the world where they have figured out how to permit energy projects. And as a result, solar projects, for example, in Europe and Australia are a third the cost that they are here. A third. If you can sort those things out, you end up with lower energy costs for people that also happens to be lower carbon, which I think is a terrific outcome. So I think there's a lot of work you can do on that front. We also, I think, need to really focus on how do we get the best use out of the grid that we have. We have a big, clunky, complicated grid, but there are a lot of technologies, a lot of innovations that people are putting into practice in other states in the country, having a lot of success that allows you to put more energy onto the system, use it more effectively, have it more effective for customers, more reliable, but not add a lot more cost. That's what we need to focus on, is how do we make sure we use the grid that we have effectively and not add costs for people. I think we also need to have utilities that are more accountable to ratepayers in terms of costs. And again, there are a lot of things they can do to invest to try and stop these cost increases that we keep seeing every single year that are really having a huge effect, not just on Maine families, but also on businesses that are trying to operate here or might want to come here. There's a lot of work we can do, and I think we can also be more nimble on our regulatory side, on our permitting side. We are quite slow, and we haven't had a comprehensive plan that gets us to here's what our energy future can look like here in Maine. And instead, right now, what we have is very expensive energy, but we also have a ton of emissions. We're burning a ton of oil in the winter to make our electricity system work here in Maine. That can't be the right outcome. But it's where we are today. And I think there's, with better planning, with a long-term view of here are the resources we have, here's the need that we have, and here's the grid that we have. How do we make sure that utilities and generators and regulators are all working together to try and move this energy system forward in a lower cost, lower carbon way? I know it can be done. I also know it's hard as hell. And the reason I think it can be done and that it's hard as hell is because I've done it. I spent my life working in utilities, building these projects. I know that it's complicated, but I'll tell you a story about this project we built over in Clinton, Maine, where I saw that if we were going to have more clean air and clean water and clean energy, we needed to bring everybody together. So I got utility folks and dairy farmers and community leaders and clean energy folks and regulators, and we got them all together alongside thousands and thousands of cows. And we took something that they had a lot of, manure, and turned it into something that we all need, which is renewable energy. And today that project is heating thousands of homes and factories in Maine. It's created some good jobs. It's lowering emissions for all of us. And it did it without adding costs to Maine families. That's the kind of innovation. That's the kind of we can turn this around. That's the kind of persistence and get stuff done attitude that I think is going to be critical as we reshape our energy future. I know it can be done. There are great people doing it, both in Maine and across the country. And I think if we can bring that intelligence, we can bring that planning, we can bring that innovation here, we can make a big difference in our energy future.
You are listening to Q Point Podcast. I'm Corenna Quirk, co-hosting with my husband, David Quirk, and we are having a conversation with Democratic gubernatorial candidate Angus King III. So you've been involved with wind. When critics say the windmills, they're ruining the beauty of Maine, they're not moving, what are they actually doing? Can you just address some of those issues that we do hear from day to day from critics?
Of course. Number one, I absolutely understand beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And there is nothing you can do to argue somebody into a position of, no, they look really cool. Some people think they look great. Some people think they ruin the entire view. And I have no argument with people on either side of that. I think what Maine did, which was quite thoughtful in the Baldacci administration, was they thought about and they got all these people in the room to say, where should wind projects go? And importantly, where should wind projects not go? What are the off-limits places? What are the places that are the iconic ridges, the iconic locations where we really don't want to have a wind turbine? And they brought industry together and climate activists and all those other people. And I think it was a really important process. And I think that's the essence of how we do things together, is let's get everything out on the table and have that conversation. So I used to say it's hard to hide $100 million worth of steel. There's no question that they are visible. There's also no question that they produce a lot of power. In Maine, the challenge I talked about with having to burn a lot of oil in the winter is because our winter peak is the real challenge for us. And a lot of our wind projects produce a lot of energy in the winter. So that's when they tend to operate. That's when our storms are. That's when a lot of the wind blows in Maine. You ask anybody outside on a cold day, it's also windy. So we do generate a lot of important power in that time period. And sometimes they don't run because it's not windy outside, just like solar panels don't operate when it's dark. So they are not firm baseload power. They are sort of intermittent power, and then you balance it with natural gas generally. And that's what makes the grid operate. And in Maine, obviously, we do a lot of it with hydroelectric power as well. So we have a big energy system, and they play an important role in the system. They provide lower cost and low carbon energy, which I think is important. And Maine actually has the potential to have the lowest cost next round of renewable energy in all of New England. As New England starts looking for more renewable energy, the potential up in northern Maine is probably the biggest, lowest cost power available of any kind of power. But that's something that's going to take probably a decade to build because you've got to go through the permitting process. You have to build more transmission. There's a lot of work that's going to go into that if that's where we can go. I think there's an important opportunity there for Maine. It can be economically beneficial as well as from an energy standpoint. But I would go back to the Baldacci time when they made that effort. And I think that's the kind of thing we need to keep doing on any energy project. You've got to think about who are all the stakeholders. You got to get them all in the room. And that's what I've done my whole career. And I think that's the trick with energy is, the CMP ads say flip a switch and we're there. It's not that easy. It's easy for you at your house, but it's really hard to generate this energy. And Maine and the nation continues to demand more energy. Our phones, our data centers, our trucks that are plugged in, all of those things take more and more energy, our heat pumps. So the demand for more electricity continues to go up. And we just have to make sure that we've got a good, solid plan that takes everybody's perspective into account. Again, we've got to start thinking differently about it. I think we have not done a great job of bringing those people together. And one of the lessons of my career is Anytime I sit in a meeting in a business, there are 10 people around the table. There's not a single meeting in my entire life, and I suspect you've had the same experience, where you say, okay, all the Democrats, you sit on that side, and the Republicans are going to sit on that side, and I'm only going to listen to the Democrats. That would never happen. Never. A, good ideas come from everywhere, and B, that's just not how the world operates. And yet somehow in our political life, we've gotten to this place where that's the only way people operate. That's the only way they get to an answer. And I just think it's not the way Maine is. It's not the way I am. And I just don't think it's the way forward if we're going to solve some of these really difficult problems. That's a long answer and not only related to windmills, but it's really important that that's the kind of approach that we're taking on all of these things is how do we bring people together? How do we listen to everybody? Ultimately, someone is going to not be perfectly happy with every solution. That's okay. But I think you've got to be able to bring people together, find some common ground, apply a little common sense, and that's how you're going to get things done.
How are you going to get the Democrats and the Republicans working together? Because as of right now, they are definitely not working together. Everything seems to be passed just by the majority. So it's going to be tough for the next governor to change things up.
I think it's going to be tough. And it's going to be tougher if the next governor is hyper-partisan. Fundamentally, I don't think that's where most Mainers are. I think most Mainers live in the middle. Most Mainers really worry about, do they have a decent meal in the morning? Do they have a roof over their heads that they can afford? Are their kids getting a decent education? And is there health care for their parents? And then do they have a little bit of money left over at the end of the week so that they can go on vacation and hunt or fish or do the things that they love to do with their family? So part of the way is, and I'd credit Billy Shore, who's a volunteer fireman down the southern part of the state, he said, when you're getting ready to go in to fight a fire, nobody looks and says, okay, who's got the Republican idea and who's got the Democratic idea on how we're going to go and fight this fire? It's just we're going to go and fight the fire. And right now, we've got some things that are on fire. We're not in a moment where it's just going to be the Maytag repairman and your feet are on the desk and there are going to be squabbles about things that are relatively unimportant. Housing is a huge challenge. Energy is a huge challenge. And these are things we've already talked about. But we also have our schools used to be in the top 10 in the country, and now we're in the bottom. That is a huge challenge. And healthcare is a similar problem. So I think we've got some real live problems that affect everybody's lives. And to me, if you focus on that common ground that we all have, that we all share, there's a real opportunity. I have an old friend named George Smith, who you guys may know. He used to be the head of the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine. And George was a pretty opinionated guy. And one time someone walked up to him and said, George, I think you and I disagree on about 90% of the way the world works. And George, without skipping a beat, said, well, then let's work on the 10%. And they did, and they got something done. And I think George pointed a way forward for us. If someone doesn't agree with me on how to fix the economy, that's okay. Let's work together on how we're going to build more housing. If they don't agree with me on how we're going to fix education, that's okay. Let's work together on cutting red tape so that people can build their businesses and grow more jobs that have higher wages. Let's work together on fixing some of this healthcare mess, and then we can duke it out over climate. I really do think that there is a fair amount of common ground on what our challenges are. And there are going to be disagreements about the specific policies, but I think as long as we keep our focus on how do we get something done with a bias towards action, with a bias toward how are we serving people in Maine, how are we making people's lives better? Are we bringing people together? Are our kids better off? Those sorts of things are the kinds of things that I think ultimately get things done, and then making sure that you're accountable for the dollars and the results. I think that's the path forward. And look, am I going to agree with the Republicans on everything? Absolutely not. I'm not going to agree with the Democrats on everything. Ed Koch, the old mayor of New York, used to say, if you agree with me on 80% of the things, vote for me. If you agree with me on 100% of the things, see your therapist. And I think that's about right. So nobody's going to agree all the time. What's important is, do you come at it with positive intent? Do you believe that the other side comes at it with positive intent? And if you assume that and you start focusing on these common issues, that's how we're going to start to move forward. The good news is I think Maine has a history of that. So I do think there's an opportunity.
Thank you for joining us for part 1 with Democratic gubernatorial candidate Angus King III. Make sure to tune in tomorrow, Sunday, January 25th at 6:30 a.m. on VOM, The Voice of Maine. You don't want to miss it.
You've been listening to Q Point.
Follow us at qpointpodcast.com or on your favorite streaming app.
This is where you can get the news from the people who make the news.
Make sure to join us next time.
We hope you tune in.
Q Point Podcast invites guests and candidates from all parties to join the conversation. The views, information, opinions, and comments expressed during this program do not necessarily represent those of the host, Q Point Podcast, associates, affiliates, and CQRE LLC.
Thanks for being a part of the conversation. The most important voices aren't always the loudest ones. They're the voices of everyday people, raising families, running businesses, serving their towns. That's who we want to hear from. Share your ideas with us online, and let's make sure those voices are never left out. Find us on Facebook or on X or at qpointpodcast.com. We look forward to hearing from you. Catch every episode at qpointpodcast.com or wherever you stream. Tune in and tell your friends.